Fate is a young gatekeeper who works for these assholes. They barely pay him anything, and when they do, they treat him like shit. And they're supposed to be holy knights, but in this world you can get discriminated against based on the skills you're born with. So every day he just gets treated like this, for the most part. But thank God, not everybody in this world is an asshole. This girl called Lady Roxy is also a holy knight, and she steps in to save him. As a fellow gatekeeper and a holy knight, she tells him to let her know if it ever happens again. And he would, but he doesn't want to put any burden on her. Then we come to find out he's so poor he can barely afford a proper meal. And the guy before him was treated the exact same way. Leaving the tavern, he sees some burglars jump in the wall. So he goes to let Roxy know. She takes off to fight them, but one of them escapes towards Fate. And this is where his story really begins. Fate kills him, but his skill activates. Gluttony is a skill that takes the stats of anything the user kills and adds it to them. So after killing the burglar, he gains the skills of identify and telepathy. So without him knowing, he could read Lady Roxy's mind because she touched him. And she genuinely cares about him. So much so that she offers him a job to work for her. And that's a no-brainer for him. Of course he goes to work for her. A little more on the skill of gluttony. It might sound very powerful, but the drawback is that you're eternally hungry. You can't escape it. You might get very strong, but the hunger will always be there, and the hunger grows. Before he goes to work for Roxy, he decides to get a weapon, but he's broke. So like usual, he's discriminated against. All he has is 2 silver coins, which took him 5 years to save. So the merchant shows him the scraps. But one man's trash is another man's treasure. He finds a talking sword. That cleans up pretty nice. So he decides to take it for a test run, goblin slaying. Starts killing goblins and taking their stats. And he never really fought before, but he's doing pretty good. After the fight, the sword explains that he chooses its wielder, that's why he was in the scrap bin, because he doesn't just fight with anyone. And the best part about being able to hunt monsters is that he gets paid way more money. So he takes his money and cleans himself up. So things are looking good, but he bumps into trouble. Some guy walking around with a young girl. And he thinks the guy's a little sus, so he touches the girl to be able to read her mind. And he was right, she's being kidnapped. So he decides to follow them to a deserted building. Turns out the girl is an orphan, and he kidnapped her for a holy night. But fate steps in to save her. Turns out the guy is still there, and he chases them into a dead end. Fate tries to save the young girl, but gets cornered into a dead end. But little does the attacker know, he's the one being cornered. Fate slashes through his guard with ease, then stabs him in the chest to find out who sent him to kidnap the child. Vlaric, one of his old bosses and a holy knight. He kills him and takes his stats, then takes the girl back to her orphanage. The next day he goes to start his new job, but the hunger from gluttony starts to kick in. He's expecting to meet Roxy's father, so he's a little shy. But she doesn't lead him to the house. She takes him to his grave, where he finds out that her father died just 5 days earlier. This makes her the head of her household and his direct boss. He starts working immediately and gets along with his co-workers. But he can't keep away the hunger from gluttony anymore. Roxy can tell something is wrong, and he tries not to worry her, but he ends up fainting from the hunger. Fate decides to go hunting to satiate his hunger, but these little shits are giving him a hard time. Luckily for them, he could still keep his cool, because all he could think about was killing them. One of the effects of gluttony is that if a person with lower stats look into your eyes when you're in starvation mode, they can't move. That works for goblins too, but regular goblins aren't enough to fix his hunger. So he decides to step up to hobgoblins. Still easy prey for him. Maybe a bit too easy, so he hunts them until his hunger stops. Now that he's out of starvation mode, most of his powers are gone, so he decides to rest up in this tree. That's when Greed explains to him that for the rest of his life, he's just gonna have to keep hunting monsters. Then he hears something big approaching, carrying one of the same guys from earlier. But now most of his abilities are gone. Fate runs into the Goblin King, munching on one of the guys who gave him a hard time earlier. His stats are a lot lower than the Goblin King's, but he knows he won't get another chance. His sword, Greed, guides him on how to fight it. With Greed's sharpening ability, he's able to chop its arm off, then falls back for the counterattack. The king is down an arm, but Fate can no longer use sneak attacks. It's a head-on fight, and most of Fate's abilities are gone right now. The king goes on a rampage, and he's trying to figure out how to get rid of the club. Greed says to trust him, and they manage to disarm the king. Then he goes in for an attack, barely dodging the king's counter, but manages to take his second arm. With the king unable to attack, Fate goes in for the finishing blow. Then Gluttony consumes the king's stats and skills. After their fight, Greed tells Fate about his other forms, which would require Greed to consume all of Fate's stats. It's not something he's required to do, but he does it anyway, because he trusts Greed, and this bow is his second form. After defeating the Goblin King and consuming his stats, Fate spends a day with Roxy in town, and she still doesn't know his secret. He doesn't want her to know about Gluttony, his skill, or Greed, his sword. In the day he works for her, and at night he hunts to feed Gluttony. While they're out in the town, he overhears two men talking about a donation to an orphanage of a Goblin King's heir. It's actually him, but he can't say anything because it would basically out him. It's the orphanage of the girl he saved in Volume 1. While they're still outside, he buys a mask that can hide his identity, and tries his best to hide it from Roxy. To throw her off, he shows her gems at the stall, and he wants to get her one, but he decides to use his skill Identify to open a geode to find her a rare one. As a holy knight, she cracks the geode open with ease, and promises to treasure the gift. With his new mask, he plans to hunt Vlaric, the guy who was kidnapping the kids and his former boss that treated him like shit. Or that was the plan until Roxy decided to take him to her home village. She has to visit her mother and stop these monsters called kobolds from attacking her village's crops. Gluttony becomes aware of the monsters and wants a piece. They make it to Roxy's house, and Fate is introduced to her ill mother. She teases them about whether or not they like each other, to which Fate confesses he adores Roxy and would serve her until death. She gets flustered and runs away, after which her mom confesses that she's kinda worried about her. But Fate assures her that her daughter is doing just fine. Later that day, after helping out some villagers, he comes across a girl with a huge battle axe. She starts talking to him, and he notices she has the same eyes as his starvation mode. He tries to use Identify on her, but it doesn't work. Without much context, she says that she'll leave the kobolds to him, but he owes her. Later that night, he goes hunting for the kobolds. He comes across a few normal ones, but also a warrior. Greed lets him know that even a holy knight like Roxy would stand no chance against it. At the moment, his stats are really low in comparison because he gave Greed stats in order to power up. But he still wants to fight it. He kills one with an arrow to lure the other younger ones. He kills them with arrows, then switches Greed back to a sword to fight the bigger ones. He gains some stats from this, but he still has a few mid-level ones to take out before he can catch up to the king. But the warrior king rushes him before he could kill the last one. Luckily, when they thought he was down, it came to him, and he killed it. Now he's on even footing with the king. The king attacks, but Greed wants to end the fight quickly, so he asks Fate for 10% of his stats to power up an attack. He blasts the king into pieces, with ease, and he takes the stats, but Gluttony tries to take over his body. Fate finishes the kobold leader, then Gluttony activates. He gains its stats, but consuming so much at once prompts Gluttony to try to take control of him. Greed tells him to suppress the urges or he would end up losing himself. The next day, Roxy and her group find the battlefield that he left behind. Since there were no survivors, she returns home with Fate already there to greet her. She explains the situation and he wants to know if she suspects anyone. She says it's just a guess, but she suspects the girl with the battle axe from yesterday. Lucky for him, or so he thinks. As they're leaving, Roxy's mom explains to Fate that she's probably going to die soon, and wants to know if he could be there for her in her absence. She awaits his answer on their next visit. They're back in the city and Fate notices Roxy being a little bit strange. Then he finds out she's going on the same expedition that killed her father a few weeks earlier, by the people he hates the most. Since the beginning of the story, the Vlaric family has been giving Fate shit. And now they're trying to send away his love interest to get killed on a mission. Luckily for us, he's a man who likes to take his revenge sooner rather than later. Finally, Vlaric decides to come hunt him. And Fate is so mad, he decides to take off his mask to show him who he's fighting against. The same guy they would step on. He's baffled by how powerful Fate became. And now the stage is set because Fate is half-starved. In all honesty, it's not much of a fight because Fate was ruthless. Hado tries to attack him with his strongest attack, but he's way too slow. Fate toys with him and breaks his sword, then deals back to him the same treatment they dealt to him. He grabs him by the neck and drags him through the forest, leaving Hado to beg for mercy. But there was no mercy for the kids he tortured, for Fate, or for Roxy. Fate throws him into the air and tells Greed to take 30% of his stats for an attack. Fate launches 3 black arrows into his ascending body, leaving him with 1 limb. And despite all that, Fate is still half-starved. Hado begs for his life once again, and Fate decapitates him with no mercy. Then he tells Greed to take all his stats to level up, because he didn't want the stats of a Vlaric running through his body. Soon after, Roxy leaves for her expedition, and Fate decides to follow behind her and use Gluttony to protect her. After murking Hado, leveling up Greed, and deciding to follow Roxy, Fate makes it to the town of Tetra, a town he passed through years ago after being exiled as a child. And of course Gluttony is still acting up, so he decides to go to a tavern. He makes it to the door but can hear people arguing. Then a man flies through the entrance. He's begging the people inside to have pity on him and help his village. Literally begging. He turns to Fate's direction and recognizes him immediately. And Fate recognizes him as well. One of the same kids that stoned him when he was being exiled. Fate is from a small village where he lived with his father after his mother died. But because of his skill Gluttony, after his father died, they exiled him immediately. Now the tables have turned, and he's begging Fate to help the village. He can't ask Fate for forgiveness, but he needs his help as an adventurer because no other adventurer in the city would help them. Because it's where his parents are resting, and because he needs to hunt monsters for Gluttony, he decides to just do it. Even Seth is surprised that he said yes, knowing full well that Fate should resent them. They make it back to the village, and Seth's father is mad that he brought Fate back to the village, even though they need the help. He goes as far as saying if the monsters decide to attack tonight, they'll feed Fate to them to buy themselves some time. So he tells him not to let Fate leave. It's been a long time, but Fate isn't even surprised by his behavior. Seth invites Fate to his house, where Fate met his daughter and found out that his wife died to the same monsters. After having his daughter, Seth changed his ways, which gives Fate a little bit of hope. They start talking about the monsters, and Greed points out that it's probably gargoyles. And after terrorizing the village for so long, they would definitely attack in full force on a night like tonight. Fate rushes outside, but they had already started attacking. They're pretty low level, but there's a lot of them. Fate decides to test out the scythe. The scythe's ability is to cut through anything, even through its essence, so it works great against magic. The gargoyles charge up for a combined attack, and Fate dodges to set up his own attack. He throws the scythe, and it cuts through their attack, and he kills all of them in one shot. Greed returns to his hands, and there's only one left. The leader of the swarm. Learning from the mistake of the others, it decides to go for a point-blank attack. But Fate decides to hang tight, cutting through the attack and the monster with ease. Gluttony takes the stats and the skills, but the village is in ruins. After that, he visits his parents and comes to terms with everything that happened. Fate saves his hometown and he's back on the road to join Roxy. The guy he's riding with wants to know if he's actually strong. And Fate is like, I'm as strong as a young holy knight. But that's cap because we seen what he did to Vlaric. And the driver is like, you're funny. Don't brag like that when we get to our destination. It's a holy knight's domain and you'll get the both of us killed. And Greed, his sword, is like, that sounds interesting, we should fight them. Then a group of bandits show up to rob them. The driver clings to Fate and he's like, get off me so I can fight them. And of course the bandits talk shit, they're like, what are you supposed to do? But he doesn't need to do anything. They get blown away by the mysterious girl with the battle axe. She's like, you owe me for the kobolds, so I'm collecting now. And he's like, what am I gonna have to do? She just ignores him. He tells her his name, trying to break ice or whatever, because they're gonna be riding together, and she's like, okay, Fate. Fate of Gluttony. And his face immediately switches to, bro, how do you know about that? Who told you about that? Cause I didn't tell anyone. Then she gets really close. I am mine of wrath. Looking forward to working with you. They make it to their destination, and the people there find them a bit strange. Mine fell asleep on the way there, and he can't wake her up because if he does, she might get mad and basically knock the whole city off the map. And we learn this information because Greed actually knows her. I'm kinda liking how Greed keeps leaving out key pieces of information until the very last moment. He also lets him know that her axe is a weapon of mortal sin, just like he is. They run into some guards while looking for a place to stay, and the guards stop them and tell them they can't move past this checkpoint because they aren't citizens of the city. Turns out the leader there, the Holy Knight, is a tyrant, and he segregates everyone based on social status and class. They make it to an inn for travelers, and Fate decides to go hunting after dropping Mine off. While outside, he goes into half-starved mode, and Greed tells him that he needs to be able to control it better. So he trains to sustain it by killing low-level monsters in intervals. He also tries out a new attack with Greed in his bow form. When they're finished training, he decides to go ahead and feed Gluttony. At first, he can sense some small fry in the distance, but then he senses something bigger. Another crown beast, and he's starving. After training with Greed, Fate decides to feed Gluttony. And lucky for him, he senses something big nearby. It's another crowned beast, and a group that he came across earlier is fighting it. But they won't be able to hold out for much longer, so he decides to take over. He jumps in and tells them to back away from the area because this monster is his, and they're like, there's no way you can beat that by yourself. And he tells them, if you stay here, you're gonna die, so leave. He runs up, slashes its arms off, then it breaks apart and uses the parts as projectiles. He manages to get rid of them, and now it's just the core left. But when he goes to destroy the core, it sinks into the sand. Really, bro? Running? Fit is like, Greed, let's end this, take 10% of my stats. And Greed is like, whoa, give me 20 and we have a deal. He says deal, and look at this attack, bro. He ends up killing it, but this time around, he doesn't go into that weird euphoria state because he was training with Greed. The other hunters thank him, and he heads back to town. The next morning, he wakes up, and Mine drew on his face, because he did the same thing to her when he dropped her off. And she's like, you reap what you sow. He goes to collect his reward for the crown beast, and Mine wants some. He ends up giving her half because she says that she usually hunts them and gives the money to her village because her village is destitute. So he's like, okay, I wouldn't know what to do with all this money anyway, so here's half. When he goes to the teller to split the money, she tells him that the Holy Knight who runs the city is looking for him. Probably because he wants to hire him. And she's like, oh look, he's over there talking to Mine right now. Talking to Mine? He calls Mine a brat and she knocks him out of the hotel. She's like, he'll live. Probably. God damn it, we gotta go. So they set off again, but they break down halfway to their final destination. And they're basically stuck where they are for a few days. He's walking around in this village and everyone looks so happy and everything seems so peaceful, and he's wondering why aren't there monsters attacking or anything like that. Greed tells him that they might have a strong protector. So he's like, okay, that means I can chill then. Before I go deal with Mine's problem, I can just relax. Or so he thought. Out of nowhere, this guy shows up and he's like, you trying to run this fade?